Hello everyone, I'm Ryan, lead designer of Ethereal here at Fine Ground Cryptids, and today we're going to talk about playtesting. Playtesting takes those hours of work and puts them in front of other people, and honestly, playtesting itself takes a lot of time. So we want to make a video dedicated to how to really elevate that playtesting experience so that you're getting the most out of your work. Also, we have a few tidbits in there for people that are sitting down and playtesting other people's systems. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. Okay, how to playtest. Right off the bat, you're probably wondering why this video has cooking themes to it in both the thumbnail and the opening slide here. Well, that's because we're going to use the analogy of cooking the perfect meal to build our playtest. You have the recipe. That's all about the playtest expectations. Then you have your ingredients, which are your game mechanics. You have taste, which is the feedback of each of these individual ingredients, and then eventually your final dish, which is the full play of the game, bringing it all together for that perfect meal. Now, there's a big difference though between what a good playtest is and what a bad playtest is. A good playtest, you get executable feedback. You get clear direction on adjustments from your players on things that they would like to see you revise. You have active playtesters, people at the table speaking up, asking questions, giving that feedback, and just actively looking like they have a good time. A good playtest also is very clear on what your next playtest needs to cover. Does this mean you're going back and revising the same things, or are you going to be taking it to the next level and testing something new? And then finally, a good playtest is all about understanding the hits and misses of what you've created. Where did you excel? Where could you do better next time? And what are the things you need to come back to? A bad playtest, on the other hand, looks good on the outside, but has no real substance. You didn't take anything away, you didn't really know what you should do with it, and you came out of it not prepared and not really ready to make changes. This could come from having irrelevant feedback about things that are either outside of your control or sections that you're not ready to review yet in your game, such as maybe you're testing combat and you're giving feedback on the social mechanics. A bad playtest could also be you not accepting a feedback or criticism. If you see no flaw in what you've created and zero ways that it can be improved, I'm sorry, but that's a bad playtest. And if anything, you should accept that even finished games could probably do a playtest and come away with a way that they could improve. Nothing's ever perfect, and your game probably isn't if you're doing an early playtest. There are also cases of people not tracking any of the feedback given. You're not going to remember all of the feedback that you get, and if you have a good playtest, you should be getting ounces of feedback, things that you won't remember, small things here or there. Every little tidbit counts. You need to track these things. And then a final bad playtest is players not aware that's a playtest or what they're playtesting. I've heard stories where a friend of mine was doing a playtest and they didn't even realize it until afterwards when they started getting asked questions about the system. And that's too late then. If your players don't know they're doing a playtest or they don't know what you're trying to get out of it, they're not going to be able to help you. Okay, let's jump into the recipe. What do you want from your playtest? This is a session 0 for both you and also some things that you should include for your players. When do you start playtesting? That's when you have your first important ingredient or your mechanic. You should not go deep into your gameplay design if you have not tested core mechanics that are going to affect other mechanics in your game. For example, if a combat element is a very important piece that's going to determine many factors in your class building, your leveling system, even maybe some of your social cues in the game, you need to test that out at least once or twice before you move on to creating other mechanics and testing other pieces. You don't need to grab other players to test these things. You can also test them on your own when you're in those early stages, unless it's something that you really need input from other people. What does a perfect playtest look like? We obviously just covered what a great playtest looks like, what you want from it. But now, what is a playtest supposed to be for you? The first answer here is focused deep dives on specific elements of your game in which players provide specific feedback for you to address. These are the type of playtest you do very early on. This is when you have a mechanic that you need to test, as we just mentioned, or a very specific element, one or two elements that you need to bring together to see how they feel. Then, when you're ready, you can move on to the next type of playtesting, is which is when you bring all these elements of your game together and you see how well they mesh together. That's when you start getting closer to that final dish. But you should never jump into that before you first test these other specific elements first. What tools should you have to succeed? This probably comes obvious, but not everyone is a note taker. But if you're going to playtest, you need to become one. You need to have a notebook on hand. Write down the feedback as people say. even if it's the smallest thing. When we were doing playtesting for Ethereal, if somebody just randomly said something like, oh, I wish this weapon did a little bit more damage, I would write it down. If they said something even as minuscule as like, oh, that was kind of interesting that I rolled that poorly, that to me is still feedback, because maybe there's a way that we can work around some of these feelings, and which we'll dive more into shortly. You should obviously have a printed copy of the rules you need for reference. Now, I don't mean digital, I do mean printed. It's very helpful to have your rules on hand, but having a printed copy means that you can use your highlighter to highlight any issues you see within the rules, write direct notes, arrows pointing at specific rules, question marks, anything you can that'll help you later when the playtest is done is going to save you so much time and stress in the long run. Last item that I would recommend having on hand is other handbooks to reference. Sometimes it's very nice to see how other people do their elements right at that moment. Sure, you can reference it later, but sometimes somebody might go, how do they do initiative in Pathfinder? Or how do they do initiative in D&D? Grab any books you have on hand and throw them up. Or maybe just have a few on hand ready in a tab on your phone. Next up in the recipe is, who is this meal for? And that's really, who do you want in your playtest? Now, this is a complicated answer because it sounds like everyone, but there's still a very specific list here. First is anyone who's willing to give you the time of day. We all know that the TTRPG market is swamped with a ton of people. A lot of people are trying to get their game out there and try to get playtesters. So honestly, if you find anybody that's interested, grab their name. People that are new to the genre of TTRPGs or your specific game are also really good. See how they interact with it compared to more experienced players, which is next on this list. Find people who are willing to try and break your game for the right reasons. In our very first more open playtest for Ethereal, we had a person that we knew was going to try power gaming, and that worked so well for us because they found the perfect combo of how to make a ranged tanked character that could do more damage than anybody else in the game by at least 10 times, and it was insanely strong. And I'm so glad we had him at the table because he broke our game. Just make sure it's a person that wants to break your game for the right reasons and not just to make your life a living hell. Also, people that would like the genre. You don't always need to find people that are super deep into TTRPGs. Try to find people that just like that theme. For Ethereal, we're more than open to try finding people that are just more into types of hunting Bigfoot or cryptids in real life and seeing if they want to give it a go. We have a list going on our developer side of about 20 people currently that fit all these caricatures that we have ready to go, that when we're ready to do a playtest, we go down that list and see who we want to pull into it. Not everybody's going to be ready for every type of playtest. For early mechanic playtest, you usually want to stick to people that are more familiar with the genre, unless you want to specifically find out if it works for newer people. Then, as you get into deeper playtests, access this list and find out who you think might be ready for this game. You don't even need to reach out to them right away. Just put their name down and come back to them and ask if they're interested when the time comes. Ingredients are game mechanics, the core element of your main dish, and honestly, taste everything. Your first playtest, as I said earlier, should not be every mechanic you have. If you do, you're doing a disservice to your playtest because you're not going to be able to focus on a key element, and your feedback is going to be pages long, and when you make one change to one of them, it's going to domino effect and affect every other mechanic you have. Work up to it slowly. Focus on one or two of the key elements, key mechanics at a time that are going to define your game, and then slowly from there, add more and more on. Understand how these ingredients, these mechanics work together before you bring them into a final dish. And then slowly add more ingredients together. Mix ingredients. Do some with some elements, do some without some elements. For combat and Ethereal, we probably did 5 or 6 closed playtests with just the 3 developers before we were finally ready to move forward. We had to test weapon combos, weapon essences, different combinations when you include spells eventually into the mix. And we kept going at it and kept grinding away, making changes before we finally were able to start adding in more elements and moving on. But by focusing on just the weapon system first, we were then able to build off of it easily without having to rework a lot of systems down the line. If we had done a combat that included telegraphed attacks, qualifications, essences, weapons, and then spells all together, it would have been a mess of feedback that would have made us rework stuff weeks on end. Next up is taste testing, which is taking those ingredients and grabbing feedback and knowing how to apply it. The best way to get feedback is in session 0, set up with your players and understand with them what type of feedback you are expecting. Tell them what elements you're hoping to further investigate and what you're testing. Don't leave it up to guessing or chance that they might give you the feedback you're looking for. This might sound obvious, but remember, these players don't have the same mindset as you. And be clear and be detailed with them. Say, hey, I have a weapon combo system. I would like feedback specifically on the weapon combat system, the combos that you can do with them, what you can bring forward with weapons. Tell them exactly what elements you want so that they can focus their mind and attention on that when they're playtesting it. Now, I like to go into playtest with an idea of how something's going to roll out. Does something look like it's going to be strong on paper? Does something look weak? And ask your players that also. Ask them ahead of time. Hey, how do you feel about the sword versus the axe? Because they might have a different interpretation. And also, if you go in knowing and thinking about how things are going to possibly work out, you might be surprised. And that's also a good thing. Surprises are good in playtesting because that means it goes against what your beliefs are of your own system. Because just because you've written it down one way doesn't mean it's going to come out that way. And by becoming aware of those things and becoming aware of the elements that are your preconceived notions that are wrong, it'll be easier to break that mirror, if you will, and make changes. When you're playtesting, consider these important questions to your players. What did you like about blank? What didn't you like about blank? As a player, how did you feel when another player did blank? And if you had to make a change to blank, how would you change it? These are great questions because they ask direct pieces of information from the player. You can ask them, what did you like about the weapon combo system? Or what didn't you like about it? When you put them on the hot seat of those specific questions, you know you'll get feedback directly to what you want. Once again, don't leave it up to chance that they'll give you the feedback that you're looking for. Questions like, if you had to make a change to blank, how would you change it, are useful because you put yourselves in the player's shoe. Just because something is obvious to you doesn't mean it's obvious to them. When do you ask these questions? Don't wait until the end of your playtest. That's the last thing you want to do. But also don't kill the momentum of your game with constant questions. It's a fine balance. You should hold off to some of the bigger conversations for the end. You don't want to break up that momentum that you have in the middle of the game. But you also want to make sure that you have time to get feedback in the now. So how you can do that is find small break times to ask questions to your players. Either when you guys are grabbing a slice of pizza, or if somebody's in the restroom and you're waiting for them to come back. Or maybe if it seems like there's just a small little lull as players try to gather themselves, ask one of the players that's been a little bit more attentive to the conversations, hey, how do you feel about X? Grab those small little bites of information without driving into a full conversation. This will also keep their feedback more top of mind for when you get to the end, and you can ask for more detailed questions. As it says here, instead of stopping for the entire session for feedback, ask casual questions on the go and as they come up. These questions should be more specific, ones they might not remember by the end, such as, I see you took this ability. Is there any particular reason? Or, how did you feel about your weapon jamming there? One common question we had about combos was, did you like the combo? And in that very moment, we heard somebody say to us, no, it was a little bit confusing. If we had waited for the end of the game, they might have not remembered that particular moment in the fight, this very split second, it was annoying for them to figure out how the combo worked. And this next one, I said already once, but I'll say it again. Write down all feedback, big and small, to review later. I had a 2-hour playtest once, and I had 5 to 6 pages of notes. It's crucial you write down everything. Next up is making changes mid-playtest are fine, but only if the change is major enough to directly affect your decisions or if something is outright broken. Don't change a few numbers here or there in between. Don't change something just because you want to change it now. No. If you're going to be in the middle of a playtest, see it through. The only time we ever made a change mid-playtest was when somebody came to the table and we realized that their class was inherently broken in the sense it didn't work how we thought it would. So we made some very quick changes right there. The only time I would ever make another change mid-playtest is if we found the mechanic we invented wasn't working, but we had a backup one ready to go, and that's a good way to get efficient time out of your playtests, is if you have something ready to replace something else if it doesn't work, use it. And that's also why you kind of want to go into those playtests with information and assumptions. And now, balance. Balance should not be an early playtest concern. In fact, you should probably not be doing any balancing to your game until mechanics are probably not going to be changing much more. If you do that, you're going to keep changing these numbers. As tempting as it is, focus on the mechanics first and worry about the balance at another point. Obviously, if something is super powerful, like something does 10d8 of damage versus something that does 4d8 of damage and you just overlooked it, Of course, do an adjustment, but do fine tuning. Don't waste a lot of time on balance when you're probably going to have to go and change it again anyways. Now, when you are ready to balance, you don't need to do it alone. Ask your players to help. One thing we like to do in our ethereal playtest is ask other players to track their total damage per encounter and total playtest. We can then afterwards analyze and see why would somebody be able to do much more damage than another player. Was it lucky rolls, or was there something inherently sticking out about their character? Next, ask to track total damage taken. Another great way to figure out if somebody is tanky or not tanky is by looking at how much damage they take or any other key element of health in your game. And then finally, we like to ask players how their character felt power-wise compared to other characters and why they felt that way. Sometimes damage might match, but because of how mechanics work, one player might feel much more powerful than the other. They might look at the other player and go, well, he was able to attack 3 guys for a ton of damage while I was only able to attack 2 guys. And you go, okay, well then that's an obvious change. But somebody might go, man, I did a lot more damage, but he felt more powerful because he was able to do crowd control effects and he was able to charm this character. And then that's something you need to look at from more of a character design standpoint. Finally, when it comes to balance, this is important. Remember that dice are fickle. You're going to need a sample size before making immediate balance decisions. These tests are a good way to give you vibes and can reveal some immediate issues, but obviously if somebody gets super lucky in a game and rolls a bunch of critical hits, or they roll poorly on their damage rolls, it can definitely make the numbers look different. So always take this type of feedback with a grain of salt, and remember, you're going to have to playtest over and over and over again before you can fully understand the balance of your system. Finally, you're in a spot where you can see how it all works together. Now what you're going to do is you're going to go back and repeat the previous steps on a greater scale. Look at how these elements work together. What parts look like outliers? What parts need a little bit of tuning? Maybe you're even missing a mechanic that kind of helps tie things together. This is where you're going to really get to deep dive into each individual mechanic on a grander scale. Now, feedback can become broader. You can focus your feedback on the dish as a whole. How do all these mechanics coming together feel? Ask your players, do things feel natural? Do they feel like they're all from the same game, or does it feel like you've taken elements and sort of just stuck them together? How does it feel in an actual proper environment, such as an actual game? Like, how is it intended to be played? This is where you start doing mini campaigns, 3 to 4 sessions. We're about to start our own ethereal playtest for about 4 to 5 sessions to kind of feel like how do these new mechanics work together on a longer time basis. And now this is where you can really start focusing on that balance. Start shifting your focus now on the numbers. How do these numbers look as a whole? But finally, don't forget, you can't become a master chef by only knowing how to cook one way. And what I mean by that is if you keep running these longer term sessions back to back with new people, different people, you're still looking at your system in a very specific way. And as any DMs out there know, your players aren't necessarily going to always play the game the same way. And other people, when they pick up your system, are going to test things and play things differently. Obviously, you're not going to be able to account for every situation, but there are certain ways that you can prepare yourself for this and even test your game on a greater level. Don't get so focused and siloed onto one way of how your game is being play tested. And how we do that is other recipes or desserts. These are all about using mechanics in new interesting ways and stress testing certain parts of your system. Now, don't go into any of these without telling your players what to expect, because you don't want to catch them like a deer in headlights. Make sure in your session 0 they know what type of playtesting you're doing. The first one is my favorite. It's called GM Roulette. And that's when you grab your bestiary and you randomly hand it to someone to run an encounter from it. They flip to a random page and they run that creature. Whoever finishes that creature off then gets the book, and they rinse and repeat. What this allows you to do is, first of all, see your game from a new angle and test mechanics firsthand. I'm sure that if you're the main designer of your TTRPG, you probably have not gotten a lot of chances to play it yourself, so this puts you in that seat. It also gives other players a chance to test GMing in your system. How clear are the rules? Do they know how to get the resources they need to properly run an encounter? For example, in Ethereal, this is very important for us because our Ethereal Bestiary has a ton of important information that tells the player how to run that creature. So if we're running this, in theory, if I hand the book to somebody, they should be able to pick up an encounter pretty quickly with our book. But if they don't, then we know we need to make some changes. Next up is a great way to stress test combat. called the Colosseum. It's back-to-back fights, but you have a modifier that randomly gets thrown in between. Sometimes players heal to full, other times they get their abilities back, sometimes maybe they only get some spells back. You even tell your players to bring multiple characters for this, and they're encouraged to swap. This allows you to stress test your combat, see how damage, healing, defenses work in between multiple rounds. You can test different type of rests if you have a rest system. You can balance test multiple creatures at once here. You can also have your players test and stress testing their character building. Is it easy to make multiple characters? Does it take a long time? Colosseum is a great way just to stress test a lot of different mechanics at once without having to worry about social elements, puzzles, dungeon diving, etc. The next one is high and low. This is one that I'm sure a lot of TTRPG designers do, but I think they do it slightly differently, where they go, okay, I ran a mini campaign, it went from levels 1 to max level. Great, you should do that. It allows you to see the curve over time and if there's any levels that power spike higher than others. However, high and low does something slightly different where you do one session where you're at your minimum level and then one at the max level. What this basically does is it shows you what does the player look like at their weakest right next to at their strongest. Possibly you don't want your characters to feel like demigods basically, but then if you stress test it and you see that at level 11, which is our max level in Ethereal, that they are super powerful and way too powerful, you can quickly tune it down because you have that almost that whiplash effect going in there. Finally, PvP. Bear with me on this one. It's a little bit spicy. I understand that probably a lot of systems out there aren't designed for PvP in mind. Ethereal certainly isn't. But I honestly do believe that even if your system is not designed for PvP, you should probably test to see what it feels like. Because if you go and you test it and you see that PvP feels really bad in your system, it shows how much you should really highlight in your player's book that PvP is not recommended. Also, I'm a huge fan of alternative rules, so you might even want to provide your GM some alternative rules for if they want to run a system like yours that has PvP, how they can do it. I find that PvP is a very dangerous thing to test, but it's good to get out of the way and just understand how does it look in your system, because it might also help you understand a little bit further about how your own combat mechanics work. And now, the pressure cooker. These are some hard to swallow facts, and I'm sure there's some in here that people agree with me on, and others that are a little bit more controversial. The first is, how do I find players? This is a common question because I know it's not always easy to ask for help, ask people for help, or to find people that might be willing to help. There are a ton of subreddits such as r/LFG, and there are Discords even dedicated to this. But honestly, try asking some friends. Because even if you have friends that aren't into the same scene as you, you'll be surprised that there are a lot of people out there that are willing to help you just because they know you and they see that you're making something. It's worth a shot, and even if they say no, at least you asked. Outside of that though, just going on to subreddits, making yourself part of communities, and finding other people of like-minded interests is a great way to go ahead and find people that might help you out and might playtest. Next is be mindful of your playtesters' time, and do everything you can to make this smooth for them. For early playtests, I heavily do not recommend asking your players to read the entire rulebook. It doesn't matter if your book is 5 pages long or it's 50-page long rules. Teach them the rules instead. They don't have as much time as you. They are not working on the game as much as you are. You're asking them for their help. So instead, as part of the session 0, teach them the baseline rules and teach as part of the playtest. There will be a time when you can get people to read your book and understand if the rules make sense, if it's clear, if there's any typos. But for early playtests, don't waste your time on that because you're going to probably be rewriting those rules multiple times anyways. As I just said, remember, this isn't as important to your players as it is to you. This is your project, this is your baby, and it's often easy to forget that the person next door that you've asked for help, this is more of a game night for them. Just remember that when you're asking them for help and don't overload them. I'm sure your friends and people on subreddits are more than happy to help you, but remember, this is your project, not theirs. This kind of comes back to how you get feedback, but I'm going to say, I personally hate post-game surveys people fill out. And that's because I feel that once people have left the table, if you give them a survey, they are not going to be as mindful of the feedback as when they were in the moment. Get your questions answered at the table. Try not to follow up with them afterwards. As I mentioned before, it's okay also to do playtests, especially early ones, on your own. You can make 2 or 3 characters and you can just role play by yourself. If it's just basic combat, you don't need other players for that. Once you start honing those mechanics, then bring other players on board. This one's probably obvious, but the first iterations of your game are probably rough. Be prepared to make a lot of changes and many more after that. Finally, every player has a different expectation and different preferences. You're going to need to siphon through which feedback is trying to make your game better and which ones are changing the vision. Some people are all about those hardcore survival games, other ones are all about high fantasy, some like rolling many dice while some like doing no math at all. When you're getting feedback, be very mindful of maybe the game that the person's playtesting is just not for them and the feedback that they're giving is trying to change your game into something it's not. But at the same time, you need to be ready to also possibly adapt if you're seeing the same type of feedback from many different people. And that's why it's important to get as many different types of playtesters as possible. Finally, the customer, the person that gives the feedback. You're now on the other side of the GM screen. How can you do it? How can you provide proper feedback? We'll start by giving feedback that is directly related to what the creator has asked for and is actionable. If they want to focus on combat and weapons, it's your responsibility to give that type of feedback. And always give as much detail as possible. Give your thought process. Give them everything that you have and everything going on through your mind. But avoid telling them how to design their game. Most game designers don't want to be told, this is how you should do things, this is what I would do. Instead, lead them towards ideas. Say, oh man, it was really cool that I had a sword. It would be interesting if there was the possibility of doing an axe or maybe having some other sort of attack option. Focus on emotion. Talk about how you felt about something. What did this evoke from you? Did you really enjoy something? Did you not like something? Did something make you angry? Did something make you frustrated, sad, happy, excited? Emotion goes a lot into game design, and as a TTRPG designer myself, I love hearing how my game affects their emotion. Another thing is, are you reminded of anything in particular from this experience? Not just TTRPGs, but any form of media. For Ethereal, we have a lot of people telling us that it really reminds them of government documents. And that's really good for us to hear because that means we're on the right track. Next, always provide honest feedback. Don't beat around the bush, be upfront with something. If you don't like it, say it. If you like something, say it. And that goes into the next one. Say what they're doing right. This isn't you just patting them on the back. When a designer hears that they're doing something right and you really like something, that tells them they're on the right track. That tells them that they should either focus more resources onto that, or they should make more elements move around that, or they should also just consider moving a few elements to feel more like that other element. And then finally, be understanding. Being a designer is hard. It takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of manpower, and a lot of hours, and a lot of brain power. So be understanding. Try to help them where you can. And at the end of the day, if they really want to talk about it more and it's something you're interested in, offer time to talk more about it. Some designers just need to talk through something before they get to where they want to be. And that brings us to the end of our how to playtest video. If you liked what you saw, make sure to subscribe for more design videos and eventually for more Ethereal information. Also, make sure to follow us on Twitch in the description below for weekly Twitch streams. Once again, I'm Ryan, and thank you for your time.